Rodrigo Salcedo had a voice that moved women to tears and won men over. Every Sunday, standing at the pulpit of the Fuente de Gracia Church in the El Poblado neighborhood of Medellin, he would raise his arms and speak words that people carried in their hearts throughout the week. 400 people filled the pews. Live broadcast cameras followed him. The children looked at him as if they were looking at an angel. He was 44 years old, with broad shoulders and black hair streaked with gray at the temples, giving him an air of authority earned over time. His wife, Claudia, always waited for him in the front row, impeccably dressed, with a Bible full of underlines and a smile that the entire neighborhood admired. They had been married for 18 years. They had 3 children. No one in the congregation knew that Rodrigo Salcedo had been cheating on his wife for 8 months. Valentina Rios had joined the church in March of the previous year, following a difficult breakup. She was 27 years old, lived alone in a small apartment in the Laurelis neighborhood, and worked as a graphic designer from home. She was quiet during services, but attentive. She took notes. She asked intelligent questions after the sermons. Rodrigo noticed her from the very first day. What began as spiritual counseling sessions gradually transformed into something neither of them could clearly define at first. Messages after midnight, calls not listed in the pastoral schedule, meetings in cafes far from El Poblado, where no one knew them. Until, one July afternoon, the boundaries Rodrigo had promised to God and to himself were shattered, and neither of them picked them up from the ground. Valentina wasn't naive. She knew exactly what she was getting into, but she also knew that Rodrigo was saying things to her that no man had ever said before. Not formal promises of a future together, but that intense, absolute attention that makes a person feel like they're the most important thing in the other's world. And that, for the moment, was enough for her. On Friday, February 14th, Rodrigo told Claudia he had a pastoral retreat in Rio Negro. He had concocted the pretext weeks in advance, a fake event on the church calendar, a message from a supposed colleague that Claudia would never think to verify. He kissed his children before leaving. He told his wife he loved her. Half an hour later, he was in the lobby of the Hotel Cosmos in Medellin's historic center, waiting. The Hotel Cosmos was discreet by design. 3 stars, a gray facade on Boyacá Street, without the kind of clientele that frequented El Poblado. The receptionist on duty was a young man named Andrés Pedraza, who checked in guests with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has repeated the same gesture thousands of times. At 9:17 p.m., a woman approached the counter with a small suitcase and a reservation under the name Valentina Rios. Room 318, 3rd floor. She paid in cash. At 9:34, a man in a dark suit entered through the front door. No luggage, just a carry-on bag. He checked in as Rodrigo Mora, with an ID card that Andrés scanned without looking too closely. The lobby cameras captured everything. The man crossed the lobby without stopping. He took the elevator. The display lit up with the number 3. Andrés Pedraza didn't think much of it. It was Friday night. The hotel had 22 occupied rooms, and he'd seen far stranger things than a couple who preferred to check in separately. What neither of them could have imagined was that, before dawn on Saturday, only one of them would leave the building. Room 318 smelled of pine disinfectant and stale air. It was a functional, unpretentious room. 2 yellow lamps, a double bed with a beige comforter, a window overlooking a narrow alley where cats fought over market scraps. Valentina had left her suitcase on the desk chair, unopened. She was sitting on the edge of the bed when she heard the 3 knocks on the door. Rodrigo entered with his usual energy, that mix of confidence and urgency that Valentina had learned to read as his particular way of showing affection. He kissed her before speaking. He set the bag on the floor. He took off his jacket and hung it on the back of the chair with the same precision with which on Sundays he folded the microphone before stepping down from the pulpit. For the first hour, everything was just like the other times. They talked. They laughed at little things. Rodrigo ordered 2 beers and a tray of fried snacks from room service. It arrived lukewarm, but was enough. Valentina listened to him talk about the church, about the problems with a deacon who questioned his decisions, about the pressure he felt from all sides. He was a good talker. He always had been. But that night there was something different in the air, a tension that Valentina sensed without being able to pinpoint it exactly, like when you know it's going to rain before the sky changes color. It was she who opened the crack. She'd been thinking about it for weeks. She'd rehearsed it in front of the mirror in her apartment, searching for the exact words that wouldn't sound like an ultimatum, but would make it clear that things couldn't go on like this. 8 months was too long to keep living on the margins of someone's life. "I need to know what we are," she said, her voice calmer than she felt inside. Rodrigo looked at her from the other side of the bed. He held the beer with both hands. He didn't answer right away, and that silence was his first answer. "We've already talked about this, Valentina." "No, we've put it off. That's not the same thing." He let out a long sigh, the kind that comes from the chest and not from the air. He stood up and walked over to the window. Outside, the alley was quiet. A motorcycle passed in the distance. The lights of downtown Medellin flickered over the tin and concrete rooftops. "I have a family," he said, as if it were the first time he'd mentioned it. "I know. I've always known." Valentina stood up too. She didn't want to have that conversation sitting down, in a position that made her feel small. "What I'm asking you is whether that family is the only place where you belong, or if there's room for something else." "I can't leave Claudia. I can't leave my kids." "I'm not asking you to leave them. I'm asking you to be honest with me. And with yourself." Rodrigo's voice changed, not in volume but in texture. It became harder, more closed off, like a door that's jammed. "Be honest." He repeated the words with an irony Valentina hadn't heard from him before. "And what do you want me to say? That I love you? I've already told you that I want to be with you. I've told you that too. But there are things that can't be changed overnight. You've been telling me that for 8 months, that it can't be changed overnight. How many days do you need, Rodrigo?" He turned away. There was something in his gaze that Valentina didn't quite recognize. A mixture of frustration and something darker, something she couldn't name. "Don't talk to me like that." "How am I talking to you? As if I were a liar. And aren't you?" The question slipped out before Valentina could filter it. And once it was out, there was no taking it back. The silence that followed was different from all the silences before. Heavier, more laden with consequences. Rodrigo took a step toward her. Valentina didn't step back, though something in her body wanted to. "You lie to your wife every time you leave that house," she said, holding his gaze. "You lie to your congregation every time you step up to that pulpit. You've lied to me on more than one occasion. So yes, I think the word applies." What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds, but Valentina would remember it with brutal clarity for the rest of her life. Rodrigo's hand rose. It wasn't a calculated gesture, or at least that's what he would say later. It was a reaction, he said, an impulse, something he didn't control. The slap sent her stumbling back 2 steps. The right side of her face burned. She brought her hand to her cheek, her eyes wide, more surprised than scared, though the fear came a second later, sharp and cold. "Valentina!" Rodrigo's voice cracked. He stepped closer. She raised her hand to stop him. "Don't touch me." "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." "Don't touch me, Rodrigo." He stepped back. He ran his hands through his hair. In that moment, without the jacket, without the microphone, without the 400 parishioners watching him, he simply looked like a man afraid of himself. Valentina grabbed her purse from the desk, Her hands were shaking, but her voice wasn't. "I'm leaving," she said. "Wait, please, we need to talk. We've talked enough." She headed for the door. Rodrigo stepped in front of her, not violently, but with the weight of his body blocking her path, his hands open, his voice dropping to a whisper that was meant to be calm, but was something else. "If you walk out that door, everything we've built is over. Is that what you want? Get out of the way. Listen to me. Rodrigo, get out of the way." There was a moment when everything could have been different. A brief, suspended instant in which he could have let her leave, in which she could have made it to the hallway, taken the elevator, crossed the lobby, and vanished into the night in Medellin with nothing more than a swollen cheek and a lesson learned the hard way. But Rodrigo Salcedo didn't step aside. What happened in the following minutes, inside room 318 of the Cosmos Hotel, was partially recorded by the building's security audio system, a technology the manager had installed 6 months earlier, after an incident involving guests who damaged furniture and denied having done so. The microphone, small and discreet, was built into the smoke detector on the ceiling. At 11:48 p.m., the system recorded a raised female voice, a dull thud against what appeared to be a wooden surface, and then silence. A silence that lasted much longer than normal. At 2:09 a.m., the camera in the third-floor hallway captured a man leaving room 318. He carried his shoulder bag on his right shoulder and dragged a suitcase that wasn't his with his left arm. A small, wheeled suitcase with a colorful tag hanging from the handle. It was Valentina Rios' suitcase. The man kept his head down as he walked toward the elevator. He pressed the button with his knuckle, not his finger. He waited, staring at the floor. The doors opened. He stepped inside. In the lobby, the night receptionist, a man in his 50s named German Useche, looked up from his phone when he heard the suitcase wheels on the marble floor. The man crossed the lobby without stopping, without looking toward the counter, without saying goodbye or handing over the key. German followed him with his eyes until the automatic doors closed. Something unsettled him. He couldn't put his finger on it at the time. It was a vague feeling, the kind of unease you dismiss because it doesn't have a name yet. He went back to his phone. On the security monitor screen, the street view showed the man turning left and disappearing into the darkness of Medellin's historic downtown. Valentina's suitcase rolled behind him, its wheels clattering over the uneven pavement, growing farther and farther away until the camera could no longer follow them. Upstairs, on the third floor, the door to room 318 had been left ajar, and inside, the only light on was in the bathroom. German Useche wasn't a man who let himself be swayed by premonitions. He'd been working night shifts at hotels in downtown Medellin for 11 years and had learned to distrust his own intuitions almost as much as he did the guests who paid in cash and avoided eye contact. But that early morning, something wouldn't let him sit still. At 3:15, he got up from the front desk and walked toward the elevator. He didn't have a specific reason. He simply needed to move, to do something about that unease buzzing in his chest like a TV left on in an empty room. He went up to the third floor. The hallway was silent. The emergency lights cast long shadows across the worn carpet. At the end of the hall, the door to room 318 was still ajar, exactly as the security cameras had captured it 2 hours earlier. Germain stopped in front of it. He knocked twice with his knuckles. No one answered. He pushed the door open with the tip of his foot. The first thing he saw was the strange orderliness of the room. The bed not quite made, the comforter tossed to one side as if someone had hurriedly pushed it aside, the 2 empty beer bottles on the nightstand, a plate with leftover food, and the desk chair overturned with a broken leg in the middle of the room. The second thing he saw was the light from the bathroom seeping under the door. He knocked again. Silence. He opened the bathroom door. Valentina Rios was on the floor, her back against the bathtub and her legs stretched out. Her lip was split. A dark bruise covered her right cheekbone. She was breathing, but barely, with an irregularity that made Germain's blood run cold. He dialed 123 with hands that wouldn't quite obey him. The ambulance arrived in 9 minutes. The paramedics found Valentina with signs of head trauma and 2 fractured ribs on her left side. She was conscious but disoriented, unable to answer questions coherently. They loaded her onto a stretcher and took her to Medellin General Hospital, while German Useche waited in the lobby with a cup of coffee he never drank, answering questions from the first police officers to arrive on the scene. Inspector Lorena Castaño, from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Metropolitan Police, arrived at the hotel at 4:40 a.m. with the look of someone who had slept exactly 0 hours. She was a 40-year-old woman with a dry voice and a gaze that catalogued details with the efficiency of a high-resolution camera. She inspected room 318 without touching anything. She studied the broken chair, the bathroom, the layout of the mess. Then she requested the footage. The hotel manager, Mr. Hector Palomino, opened the server room with fingers clumsy from nerves and projected the footage onto a makeshift screen. Inspector Castaño saw the man arrive. She saw the exact moment he crossed the lobby at 9:34 p.m. the previous night. She saw him leave alone at 2:09 a.m., dragging Valentina's suitcase, head bowed and moving like someone who knows exactly where the cameras are. "That man knew he was being recorded," said Castaño, without taking her eyes off the screen. "How do you know?" asked one of her subordinates. "Because he never fully lifted his face. Not once." She pointed to the frozen image of the lobby. But here, just before leaving, he turned toward the front desk for half a second. Just half a second. And in that split second, she zoomed in on the image. It was blurry, grainy due to the camera's nighttime resolution. But it was enough. The man's profile was clear. His jawline, his neck, the gray hair at his temples. Castaño was silent for a moment. "Find me the name he used to check in," she said finally. "Rodrigo Mora," Palomino replied, checking the system. "He paid in cash." The ID he presented. She typed. She frowned. "That ID doesn't exist in the system." Inspector Castaño nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she already knew. "Then," she said, picking up her notebook, "we'll have to find him another way." Outside, downtown Medellin was beginning to wake up. The first buses rumbled down Boyacá Street. A vendor was setting up his arepa stand on the corner. The city was resuming its usual rhythm, indifferent as always to what was happening behind closed doors. But the cameras at the Cosmos Hotel had seen it all. And images don't lie. Valentina Rios regained full consciousness at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, in a bed at the General Hospital of Medellin, with an IV in her left arm and a nurse checking her vital signs. It took her several seconds to remember where she was. Then she remembered everything all at once, and closed her eyes again as if she could push the memories out. Inspector Castaño arrived at the hospital at 9. She sat down next to the bed without rushing, without pulling out her notebook right away. She waited for Valentina to drink some water, for the doctor to leave the room, for silence to settle between the two women with enough naturalness that speaking wouldn't feel like a formal statement. "What's his name?" she finally asked. Valentina stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "Rodrigo Salcedo." Castaño didn't write anything down yet. She listened. "He's a pastor at the Fuente de Gracia Church in El Poblado." A pause. "He has a wife, 3 children." That very morning, while Valentina was signing her formal statement, 2 officers from the precinct showed up at the Fuente de Gracia Church. The Saturday service was about to begin. They found Claudia Salcedo organizing the congregation's bulletins in the foyer, with a smile that faded as the police spoke. Her husband hadn't slept at home. Claudia called Rodrigo's cell phone 4 times in a row. All 4 times, she got his voicemail. She called the number of the supposed colleague from the retreat in Rio Negro. The number didn't exist. She sat down on one of the empty pews in the church and didn't get up again for a long time. By noon on Saturday, Inspector Castaño had a real name, a profile photo from the church's social media, and an arrest warrant in the works. She also had something else, the call history from Valentina's cell phone, which showed 243 communications with Rodrigo Salcedo's number over the past 8 months. Voice messages, audio files, photos sent back and forth. A parallel life documented with an unintentional thoroughness that no investigator could have pieced together better. The news leaked before evening fell. Someone in the congregation spoke to someone outside it, and that conversation spread with the speed characteristic of WhatsApp groups in Bogotá's neighborhoods. By 6 in the afternoon, Rodrigo Salcedo's name was circulating on 3 local news channels under headlines competing with one another to be the most shocking. The Fuente de Gracia church closed its doors without prior notice. Claudia Salcedo was taken, along with her children, to her mother's house in the municipality of Envigado. She did not speak to any journalists. She spoke to almost no one. According to those who knew her, she entered that house carrying her youngest son, asleep in her arms, and the only thing she said was a brief phrase, almost in a whisper, addressed to no one in particular. No one could repeat it exactly. But those who heard it agreed that it wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. That same night, Inspector Castaño reviewed the recordings from the Cosmos Hotel for the 3rd time. She paused on the frame where Rodrigo turned toward the front desk for half a second before leaving. She zoomed in on the image until the pixels lost their shape. She studied that blurry face for a long time. Rodrigo Salcedo had been missing for more than 18 hours. He hadn't used his credit cards. His cell phone remained turned off. No one in his inner circle reported having seen him. But Castaño knew that kind of silence well. It wasn't the silence of a man fleeing aimlessly. It was the silence of someone who had been thinking for some time about how to disappear. And that, in his experience, was far more dangerous. Rodrigo Salcedo had crossed the border into Ecuador at 4:30 a.m. on Saturday, 2 hours before Valentina opened her eyes in the hospital and spoke his name. He hadn't improvised a thing. The backpack he'd brought to the hotel didn't contain only his personal belongings. Inside were 2 million pesos in cash, a change of dark clothes, a prepaid phone purchased 3 weeks earlier at a store in downtown Cali, and the contact information for a man in Tulcan who, for a fixed fee, facilitated the discreet passage of people who preferred not to register at official immigration checkpoints. He had planned that escape months in advance. Not because he knew he would need it on that specific night, but because Rodrigo Salcedo had spent years building back doors into his own life. He was a man who never ran out of options. He had learned that long before becoming a pastor. Inspector Castaño discovered this on Monday morning when analysis of the Pan American Highway toll booth cameras showed a cash-paid rental SUV that had passed through the Pasto checkpoint at 2:15 a.m. on Saturday. The driver was wearing a cap and rested his left arm on the window with studied nonchalance. The profile matched. They cross-referenced the information with Migración Colombia. Rodrigo Salcedo had not left through any official border crossing. This confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that he had used an informal route. The investigation was extended to Ecuador in coordination with that country's national police. Meanwhile, in Medellin, the case was taking on layers the inspector had not anticipated. The cell phone recovered from Rodrigo's call records revealed conversations that went far beyond Valentina. There were 2 other women, both belonging to evangelical congregations in different cities, both with similar communication patterns, frequent contact, late-night hours, periods of silence followed by messages that oscillated between devotion and manipulation. One of them lived in Bucaramanga, the other in Pereira. Neither knew of the other's existence. Inspector Castaño spent an entire afternoon reviewing those conversations. What she found was not the profile of a man who had lost control in a moment of rage. It was the methodical record of someone using his position of spiritual authority as a tool for access. The words Rodrigo chose in those messages were the same ones he used from the pulpit. The same cadence, the same vocabulary of redemption and belonging, only applied to a completely different purpose. They called it his gift in the church. His ability to make every person feel like they were the only one in the room. Now, Castaño understood exactly how that gift worked. On Wednesday, Valentina was discharged from the hospital. Her cheekbone was bandaged, her torso's movement limited by fractured ribs, and there was an expression in her eyes that the doctor who treated her described in her report as emotional detachment. The kind of look that appears when a person has processed too much in too short a time, and the brain decides, on its own, to turn everything down a notch. Before leaving the hospital, Valentina asked to speak alone with Inspector Castaño. She asked her, bluntly, if she thought Rodrigo would return. Castaño took a second to answer. "Not to hurt you," she finally said. "Men like him don't come back when they know they no longer have control over the situation. They flee to wherever they can rebuild that sense of control, toward new people who don't know who they are yet." Valentina nodded slowly. "That's exactly what he does," she said. "He always finds someone who doesn't know who he is." That very afternoon, a call from Ibarra, Ecuador, changed the course of the investigation. A local pastor had reported to the authorities a man who had shown up at his church 2 days earlier looking for lodging. He claimed his name was Marcos. He claimed to have come from Colombia, fleeing a difficult family situation. He claimed to be a man of faith. The physical description matched exactly. Inspector Castaño took a flight to Quito that very night. The Roca Viva Evangelical Church in Ibarra was a modest building with white walls and a tin roof located on an unpaved street north of the city. The local pastor, a 60-year-old man named Abelardo Mena, had welcomed the Colombian stranger with the hospitality he considered part of his mission. He had offered him a room in the house attached to the church, meals, and the respectful silence often extended to those who say they carry a pain they are not ready to name. Rodrigo Salcedo had slept in that room for 3 nights. He had helped arrange the chairs before the Wednesday service. He had prayed aloud when Abelardo asked him to, with that fluid cadence that cannot be learned, that one simply has or does not have. The elderly pastor had looked at him approvingly. He did not know he was looking at a man with an active international arrest warrant. Inspector Castaño arrived in Ibarra on Thursday afternoon, accompanied by 2 agents from the Ecuadorian National Police. They did not rush into the church. They waited discreetly on the street, while one of the Ecuadorian agents spoke on the phone with Pastor Abelardo, explaining the situation with a deliberate calm meant to avoid any unnecessary complications. Rodrigo was in the inner courtyard when he heard the footsteps. Castaño saw him from the doorway. He was sitting in a white plastic chair, holding a cup of coffee and gazing at the guava tree growing crookedly in the center of the courtyard. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't attempt any of the things the inspector had learned to anticipate from years of arrests. He simply set the cup down carefully, as if he didn't want to spill the coffee, and waited. It was that gesture, more than anything else, that told Castaño everything she needed to know about him. The composure, the control, the ability to maintain an appearance of calm even as the world he had built crumbled around him. "Rodrigo Salcedo," said the inspector, stopping in front of him. "Yes," he replied, "just that." They handcuffed him without resistance. Pastor Abelardo watched from the church doorway with an expression that mixed confusion with something resembling grief. He had believed in that man. He had prayed alongside him. That isn't easily erased, even if the truth comes later with all its evidence. Rodrigo Salcedo was extradited to Colombia 4 days later, in a process that authorities from both countries expedited given the well-documented nature of the case. He entered the Medellin prison system on a grey Tuesday in late February, escorted by 2 agents and followed by 3 local media cameras that someone had alerted well in advance. The images had spread throughout the city by noon. The trial began 6 weeks later. The charges were aggravated assault, domestic violence in the context of abuse of authority, and use of a false document. The prosecution was also investigating the cases of the 2 women identified in Bucaramanga and Pereira, although neither of them had filed a formal complaint yet. One would do so 3 months later. The other never did. In the courtroom, Rodrigo Salcedo listened to the reading of the charges with the same expression he had worn in the courtyard in Ibarra. Still, composed, his eyes slightly lowered, not out of shame but out of calculation, as if he were weighing every element of the situation to determine how much leeway he had left. His defense attorney requested mitigating factors based on his pastoral career, on the testimonies of congregation members who described him as a good man, and on his lack of a criminal record. The prosecution presented the hotel recordings, the phone records, the fake ID, and Valentina's medical report with photographs of the injuries documented in the emergency room. The judge listened to everything carefully. It took her 12 days to issue her ruling. Rodrigo Salcedo was sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in prison. The sentence included a 10-year ban on holding community or religious leadership positions following the completion of his sentence. It was a rarely used legal provision, but the judge applied it with a 2-page justification that described, with clinical precision, the systematic pattern of abuse of positions of trust documented in the proceedings. Claudia Salcedo did not attend the trial. She filed for divorce 3 weeks after her husband's arrest and moved permanently with her children to Envigado. According to those who know her, she returned to her job as an accountant, enrolled the children in a new school, and stopped attending any church. The Fuente de Gracia congregation attempted to reorganize under provisional leadership, but never regained the number of congregants it had before. By the end of the year, it had closed its doors permanently. It took Valentina Rios several months to resume a routine that resembled her previous one. Her ribs healed before other things did. She continued with psychological therapy on a regular basis, and in an anonymous interview she granted to a journalist from a digital media outlet specializing in gender-based violence, she said something the journalist chose as the closing line of her report. She said that the hardest part had not been the blow, nor the hospital, nor the trial. The hardest part had been accepting that the words that had hurt her the most were not the ones from the hotel room. They were the ones before. The ones that had sounded true for 8 months. The ones that had used the same tone and the same vocabulary as holy words. Because those, she said, don't leave visible bruises, and they're the ones that take the longest to fade. Inspector Lorena Castaño filed the Salcedo case file on a Friday afternoon. Before closing it, she reviewed the enlarged frame from the Hotel Cosmos camera one last time. The blurred profile of the man turning for half a second before leaving. The grey hair at his temples, the posture of someone accustomed to being watched. She studied him for a moment, then she closed the folder. Outside, Medellin was still Medellin. Noisy, dense, unpredictable. A city that holds too many stories within its locked rooms. But the cameras never sleep. And sooner or later, what happens in the dark finds its way into the light.